Hey guys, this video is going to show you how to get rid of the white line that you sometimes see in the video output of SNES consoles. Now, that's the white line that you'll mostly notice in dark scenes in games, or right when you power on the console and you see the Nintendo logo. This guide's going to work for both fat SNESs as well as the minis. Pretty much every single model SNES this will work for. And the reason is, it's essentially just replacing the voltage regulator as well as the capacitor around it. Before I go any further though, if you have a SNES Mini that you're planning on adding an RGB amp into and not using its own amp, or if you're going to do an RGB bypass on one of the one-chip SNESs, you really don't need to use this guide at all because that amplifier itself will cure the problem. Now, you're still going to have the white line on composite video and S-video outputs, but at the very least, if you really just want to use RGB output and you planned on using an external amp anyway, you could totally just skip this and use the amp and you'll have equally as good of an output. But if you wanted to keep, for example, a one-chip completely stock, or if you had one of the two-chip consoles that doesn't really benefit from an RGB bypass, then this is definitely the guide for you. Or I guess if you just felt like replacing the voltage regulator, because that is a component that will eventually die. But anyway, let's show you how to start disassembling and get started. So I'm going to show a one-chip console in this video, but this is the exact same instructions for both, pretty much. So I'm going to use a power screwdriver to unscrew this thing, but don't use it when you're putting it back together, because you could actually put a divot inside the plastic. So it's really only safe for disassembly. After you're done, carefully turn it over and dump all the screws out. And then when you're lifting the top cover out, make sure of two things. First, that the lever doesn't get caught, and also that the cartridge port doesn't get caught in. You need to leave that connected to the bottom half as you remove the top. The only real differences between the Mini and the other versions of the SNES is that when disassembling, you'll have to remove the cartridge release lever, as well as the ribbon cable that holds the front cartridge ports in. And be very careful when doing that, because that ribbon cable can break or pull off very easily, so make sure to grab it from the plastic tab on the bottom and just pull straight forward. Once the motherboard is removed from the case, remove the voltage regulator screw first, and then the remaining 3 screws from the bottom. Now that everything's unbolted, you're ready to remove the voltage regulator itself. I recommend starting by adding fresh solder to the pins on the bottom, which might sound counterproductive considering that you're about to desolder this, but adding fresh solder actually makes it easier to go in and remove the whole thing that's there. Now, if you want, you could use one of those pump desolder guns for this, or even if you're patient, you might even be able to use flux and desolder braid. But after years of killing myself with those cheap devices, I finally got a knockoff desoldering gun, which makes it really easy. Make sure your desoldering pump is completely heated up, and then place it over each pin and wait until you see the solder melt. That's when you'll want to actually activate the suction inside the pump. Do this for each of them, and as you can see, I'm kind of wiggling the pins back and forth as well, just to free up any excess solder that's in there. Now, this is going to go a lot quicker with a pump like mine. If you use a hand pump or anything else, it's going to take a bit longer, and feel free to use flux or desoldering braid in order to get the last bits out. But once it's free, that's it. Just pull it right out, and you're ready to install the new one. Now, here's a trick that I like to use when installing the voltage regulator. I actually take the brand new one and bolt it to the heat shield first. This way you don't have to worry about lining anything up or putting any pressure on it. You just bolt it directly to the heat shield, then bolt that into place, and then when you're done, that's when you actually solder the pins. So now that everything else is in place, I'm actually going to bolt down the voltage regulator screw very last, and then flip it over, and you'll see the pins are in place, just waiting for some solder. So I'm going to add a little bit of flux to it, because it always makes soldering a bit easier, and then just apply solder to all 3 of those pins. And that's it, a completely solid fit with no stress on any of the pins. Next, you want to replace the capacitor that's on the output side of the voltage regulator. I don't want to list which cap to actually replace because it might be labeled different on different motherboard revisions, so I'll just show you how to test to make sure it's the correct one. All you'll need is a multimeter that has continuity test, the beeping thing, built in, and that's it, so it's actually very simple. But first you take one pin and you touch it to the ground side, the middle pin, labeled G, and make sure that it has continuity to one side of the cap. And then O, the output side, would have continuity to the other side of the cap. So by doing so, that proves that that's the one that you need to replace. Now that you've verified which capacitor you need to replace, removing it's actually very easy. Basically, you just add some flux to it and then touch it to the side with your soldering iron. When doing so, you'll heat up both sides of the capacitor at the same time, and it should pop right off. Now, in this video, it was actually giving me trouble, so I'm kind of glad that it did, so I'd be able to show an example of exactly what to do in this situation. Basically, all you need to do is add a little bit more solder to each side, and for the same reasons that you'd want to add solder to the pins on the voltage regulator before removing them, it'll actually make it easier for your soldering iron to connect. So just go through the same process again, and as you can see, it popped off really quickly this time. Now that the correct capacitor is removed, I first like to use a little bit of solder braid just to clean up the pads so they're not lumpy and make it a little bit easier to get the new cap on. And this is kind of tricky, especially if you've never soldered SMD components before. Some guys really just make it look easy, but I'm kind of glad I was fumbling around and out of practice in this video because it's more realistic to what you'll probably encounter. So I very carefully use my soldering gun to solder one side of the cap to one of the pads. And as you can see, I'm kind of struggling with the tweezers there to keep everything in place. I'm very careful too not to put too much heat onto the capacitor or you could actually damage it, but I did a decent enough job getting it in. Now that one side's in, I'm just going to solder to the other pad and other side of the capacitor and then clean up the original pad just to make sure that there is absolutely enough solder and a good enough connection on each side. Now that it's kind of more solid in place, it does make it easier to actually add the solder to. And now that it's in, I'm just going to grab my multimeter and do another continuity test exactly like before, just to make sure that it's still connected to both of the correct pins. So that's pretty much it, just those two components. Now that you're done, obviously you're going to want to test before you reassemble just to make sure everything's still working and that you didn't mess anything up on the way, but overall it's not too bad an install, so I'm sure you'll be fine. One thing to note when reassembling all plastic consoles is that you're not going to want to use any power tools because any stress on the plastic could crack it or even put those little divots in like you'll find in the SNES Mini. Another thing to watch out for is the actual power switch in the original SNESes because those standoffs tend to crack very easily. One last trick as well, if you're using the cartridge release lever on some of the bigger SNESes, you're going to want to use a little spring trick that I always use when I put mine back in. Basically, just line everything up, but have the spring flopping around on top. That way it's really easy to get it into those side holes, and then once everything's in, then pull the spring back. That way everything's just much easier to line up, and you'll have time to test the spring to see where you need to actually anchor it in order to get the best tension. Of course, if you're using the larger SNESes, you're going to want to make sure to plug the controller ports back in, and once again, just be very careful with that ribbon cable. So overall, it's not too hard of a mod to do. I think the hardest thing by far is for people that don't have a desoldering pump to try to get that voltage regulator out. I remember the first time I did it with a hand pump and some desolder braid, it took like 15 minutes just to get those 3 pins out. But obviously, as always with this stuff, the better the tools you have, the faster it goes and the easier it is. But if you have a good desolder pump, you'll spend more time assembling and disassembling than anything else. The one thing too that's very hard about these mods is it's really hard to capture pictures of the white line in action. I found the best way I did it is by using a CRT, but SOM actually donated one of his pictures that I think is the best example of before, after just the voltage regulators replaced, and after the capacitor is replaced. So thanks very much to him for donating that pick, because as many as I took, I couldn't quite get it to look the same way that he did. So, and that's really most importantly how it looks to my eyes when I see it on some of these CRTs. So thanks to him for doing that. For people that want more technical information or possible other fixes, you could check out the page on the website. There are certain debates going back and forth on if any of those other fixes are actually better or worse than this, but overall, no matter what, replacing the voltage regulator isn't going to hurt anything as long as you use the correct one, which is linked in the description. And same thing with replacing that capacitor. So at the very least, the worst thing that could happen to your SNES is nothing at all. You just replaced old components with new ones. Unless you break it, of course. But as always, any comments or criticism, please leave down in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you guys, and I'm going to try to keep making more of these videos, and I'd like to try to keep getting better. So, please keep your feedback coming. And as always, thank you so much to the Patreons, because there's no way any of these videos could happen without you guys. So thanks again, and I'll see you next time.